All right, welcome to the Future of Freedom Foundation's conference, the National Security State and JFK, which I'm certain you are going to find absolutely fascinating. The Future of Freedom Foundation, as many of you know, is a nonprofit educational foundation. I'm Jacob Hornberger, the founder and president of the foundation. Since the very beginning in 1989, our mission has been to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the libertarian philosophy: individual liberty, free markets, limited government. And naturally, most of our focus over the years has been on the libertarian principles of economic liberty, as many of you know. But we also have taken a leading role in the examination of the principles of limited government, the limited government republic that was envisioned by the framers and the founding fathers when they called the federal government into existence with the Constitution. And so, as part of this, we have taken a fervent stance against what we call the national security state way of life, including what President Eisenhower called in his farewell address the military-industrial complex, along with all the things that have come with this way of life: the regime change operations, the overthrow of democratic regimes, the partnerships with dictators, the assassinations, the torture, and everything else. We have published many books over the years, some of which pertain to the theme of this conference. These include The Kennedy Autopsy, The Regime Change, The Evil of the National Security State, JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, CIA and JFK, The Failure of America's Foreign Wars, and Liberty, Security, and the War on Terrorism. We've also put on some fantastic conferences over the years relating to this theme. In 2007 and 2008, we had two fantastic conferences on civil liberties and foreign policy, where we examined the consequences of the interventionist foreign policy that has come with the national security state. And we had a great array of speakers, liberals, conservatives, and libertarians that were making the case against foreign interventionism and the critical importance of civil liberties. These included Judge Andrew Napolitano and Ron Paul and many other notable figures, including some of the speakers that we have here today. And we also did a fascinating conference within a conference a few years ago at the Students for Liberty annual conference, where we had a great panel featuring Oliver Stone, who you'll hear from later today, and Jeremy Scahill, who works over at The Intercept, and then a professor named Peter Kuznick, who works closely with Oliver Stone. And then, again, a mixture of liberal, conservative, and libertarian speakers exposing these students to the critical importance of civil liberties to a free society. Recently, we've had some college tours that we've engaged in that have been really exciting. We had two tours that took us to the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Far West, that consisted of a panel talking about foreign interventionism and civil liberties to college students. And the panel consisted of a liberal, a conservative, and a libertarian making the case for civil liberties. And the panel consisted of, the liberal was Glenn Greenwald, who was the journalist from The Guardian and now with The Intercept that worked with Edward Snowden on releasing the super secret surveillance records of the NSA. And the conservative was Bruce Fein, the noted conservative who writes regularly for the Washington Times. And then I was a libertarian. So, and all these videos are online at our website, fff.org, and they're timeless in nature. So anybody that wants to learn about the case against foreign interventionism or the critical case in favor of civil liberties can just come to our website and access these fantastic timeless videos. Most recently, we've been doing some college tours opposing the war on drugs, which we consider one of the most horrific, immoral, and destructive government programs that has ever been enacted. And yeah, there's some applause, justifiably so. And then as part of this, we did a great program at the University of Texas featuring Ron Paul and Glenn Greenwald and the libertarian columnist for the Washington Post, Radley Balco. And then we decided to do something different. And this program I am so proud of, I can't even tell you, and how pleased I am with this, that we decided to target what are called historically black colleges and universities with a program called End the Drug War. And so we found some college students at 2 campuses that are interested in civil liberties, or there was another group, a criminal justice group. And we worked with them on putting a program on at Morgan State University, a historically black college, and also Florida A&M University in Florida. And you know, it's really great going to these campuses because the drug war, as many of you know, it's racist and bigoted to the core, both in its origins and its consequences. And so it's just been great being able to connect with these students on something that really impacts them in a personal way. You know, several years ago, I was at a libertarian social function, and somebody came up to me and said, "What do you consider the biggest threat to our freedom and our well-being, our economic well-being?" And I suspect they thought I was going to say, oh, the terrorists or the Muslims or the communists or the illegal aliens or the drug dealers or something, and I didn't hesitate. I said the biggest threat is the national security state. Both economically, in terms of the money that they're spending, the debt they're incurring that's bankrupting the country, but also in terms of the destruction of our liberty. And over the years, I've mulled over the thought of having a conference. Many of you know that we've written a lot on the Kennedy assassination, which is part of this overall structure of analyzing the national security state, especially Kennedy's war against the CIA and the Pentagon, Joint Chiefs of Staff. And about 3 years ago, I started mulling over a conference like this. And I thought, you know, if I could bring together the speakers that have had a big impact on me and my intellectual development, it would be so exciting. And finally, we decided we're going to do it. And so we put this thing together, and lo and behold, the speakers that I invited, that you're going to be here today, everybody said yes. And I was just so pleasantly surprised and excited, because every one of these people that are speaking today have been, for me, heroes. Their work has been heroic in terms of what we're going to be examining today. And so it's exciting to be putting this program together, and I want to thank you for coming. We're videotaping the proceedings. The videotapes are going to be free online for people to access later on. You provide the audience for the speakers. You provide the energy for the speakers, so it's great to have you here. I want to especially thank those of you that have supported us with donations over the years. We couldn't put on programs like this without your donations. We have a monthly journal called Future of Freedom, and it goes for $25. You can subscribe at our website at fff.org. We have a daily publication called FFF Daily that is, we put a lot of time, energy, and thought to every morning at 6 a.m., and that's for free, so we invite you to subscribe to that. But obviously the $25 subscriptions do not fund programs like this and our tours and so forth. It's those of you that help us out in a bigger way that enable us to do that. And I want to especially thank the people that funded this conference. As you can imagine, the $99 registration fee doesn't come close to covering all the costs of the conference, and there's a particular some people that gave us the funds that enable us to do this conference, and they want to remain anonymous, and they know who they are, and we know who they are, and we just want to say thank you. As far as the format goes, those of you who have attended our conferences know our normal format is we have an hour lecture and with 45 minutes with the lecture and then 15 minutes Q&A. This is different. We have so many speakers. We have 11 speakers. We didn't want you to go home and say, God, I didn't get my money's worth for my $99, you know. So we got a jam-packed schedule, and we changed it around. We've eliminated now some breaks, and if you need to take a break, fine. We're not going to, the show goes on, but you can see it later, what you missed on the videotape. And there will be no Q&A, and every speaker has been advised that he's got to stop exactly at that moment, because you know what happens when you start getting late, you start pushing forward, and we got to finish at 6:15. So we're going to be running a tight ship. When there are breaks like lunch or coffee break. Please be in your seats about 2 or 3 minutes beforehand so we can then continue going. So without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs holds the title of University Professor, the highest rank of professorship at Columbia University. He is a special advisor to former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals. Sachs has authored 3 New York Times bestsellers, The End of Poverty, Commonwealth, and The Price of Civilization. His most recent book is The Age of Sustainable Development. At the age of 28, he became a full professor with tenure at Harvard. Jeff was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2004 and 2005. In 2013, he authored a book on President John F. Kennedy's remarkable peace speech at American University entitled To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace. And that book is absolutely fantastic. I cannot recommend it more highly. Please welcome Jeffrey Sachs.
Jacob, thank you so much, and thank you for bringing us together for this wonderful conference. I feel very privileged to be here and very thankful to have a chance to be together with you this morning. I'm not a historian in a room filled with historians, so that's a risky start. I am a lover of JFK's quest for peace, as I'm going to describe in a moment, and I'm sure that some of the historians here can fill in some or even many of the pieces that I'm going to describe this morning. I fell in love with President Kennedy's speech on peace that he gave in June 1963, and I'll explain why in my remarks. And I took that speech as an example of a kind of leadership that showed how to inspire people to a better world. And I had a wonderful occasion after reading it and learning a bit about the history of it. I wouldn't say all of the aspects, and I was certainly not an expert on the period, but I was asked by the BBC several years ago to give what they call the Wreath Lectures, which are global lectures, and I spoke about the challenges of sustainable development in our world. And I devoted one of the lectures to Kennedy's peace speech. And I had the pleasure to have Theodore Sorensen sitting right in front of me as I gave that lecture at Columbia University. That's a little nerve-wracking, by the way. It's nerve-wracking enough for me to have so many historians in the room, but it was nerve-wracking to have the co-author of that speech, I think it's fair to say, sitting directly in front of me. And I gave my interpretation of the speech and walked down to greet Ted Sorensen, whom I knew and afterwards became close friends with. And he said, "Jeff, you got it." That was a great relief. And it gave me both the confidence and the inspiration to learn more and to try to put Kennedy's ideas into their historical context. And in fact, I asked Ted, who was a neighbor at the time in New York City, and an incredibly wonderful, wonderful person. Of course, one of the greatest wordsmiths in American political history, and a lovely individual. I asked him whether it would be all right if I tried to write a book about the speech, and he went one better, said that we could work on it together. And soon after that, he had a stroke and died. And so I never had the chance to work on the speech directly with him and to ask him all the questions that I then could not get direct answers to about context and purpose and some of the choices of ideas in the speech. And indeed, I put aside the project a little bit out of the grief and feeling that it wasn't really possible until it became the 50th anniversary of the speech in 1963. And I said, if I'm ever going to write about this, this is the only time. And so I wrote a book called To Move the World, which is a quotation of President Kennedy in one of his speeches to the UN, and it's about his quest for peace. So I think that this is a suitable, I hope useful opening to frame what will be a wonderful discussion of many, many themes around Kennedy and around the national security state and around its dangers. And those are themes of this foundation that I agree completely with. I regard our national security state as a profound danger to us and a profound infringement of our freedom and a reckless war maker in this world. And I think Kennedy took brave steps to try to overcome those tendencies of the war machine. And that's really the story of his quest for peace, at least in part. So I'll bring us back to those days, starting with his inaugural address on January 20, 1961. And in fact, to talk a little bit about these events in a chronological way. For me, in this remarkable address, and when you read and listen to, again, Kennedy's speeches, of course, this is probably the most iconic of all of them, but the entire body of speeches is such a wonderful treasure for America. And for a couple of years, I drove my kids completely crazy because I made them listen over and over again to this speech and that speech, and you got to listen to this, and oh, you have to hear this. Because the more you listen, the more it's not only great ideas, in my view, and important ideas, but also a kind of poetry and a kind of deep inspiration. But one of the things that Kennedy said early on in his inaugural address is, the world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. I quote this almost daily because my work at the UN involves trying to abolish all forms of human poverty. And I think Kennedy was right about this. But it's also important, in my view, to understand President Kennedy's basic thinking, a certain kind of sadness and a certain kind of awareness of our danger to ourselves and of this poignancy of modern times, almost you could say an existential reality of modern times, that we are so technologically advanced, so proficient that we can accomplish marvelous positive things in longevity, in health, in ending poverty, but at the same time we have the capacity to completely destroy ourselves and wreck the world. And it's especially poignant in my view because studying Kennedy's thinking about this from his PT 109 days to his days as a senator and his writings and speeches during his presidential campaign, which was a many-year campaign to become president in 1961. He thought about this poignancy hard, and he came into office determined to make the world a safer place. And yet it turned out, and this is a human fate, within a year and a half, he had even helped, not by design, but by accident, to bring the world to the brink of annihilation. And that was a shocking truth for him, and it was a shocking fact for the world. But I take this statement to be both true, true for us, true in Kennedy's time, and very much a framing of his own thinking. Well, his administration, of course, started with a debacle, one of the worst in American foreign policy history, actually, because it led on to more debacles and more near disaster. And that was, of course, the CIA inspired and led Bay of Pigs invasion. And this was something that was a legacy of the Eisenhower administration. It was CIA planned. Like most of these operations that the CIA concocts to our very day, it was a massive failure. I think the CIA gets, if it were a private company, it would have gone bankrupt about 26 times because it is a massive failure of an institution when it comes to the covert war side. And the definitive mistake that we made was in 1947 when intelligence was combined with the private army. And this was a profound error that Truman knew at the time, but in a way let happen, and it continues to haunt us to this day. Kennedy tried to have it both ways famously in the Bay of Pigs, and that is he allowed it to go forward but with deep misgivings, and so he said, we'll do it, but no air cover. It's kind of typical ham-handed, inexperienced president, couldn't stop it, doomed to fail in a way, failed massively. And it was, of course, not only a failure as an operation, but it was a massive foreign policy debacle. And one of the things that I found very interesting in researching the book is reading the compendium of correspondence between Kennedy and Khrushchev, which began with a congratulatory note from Khrushchev on Kennedy's election when he was president-elect, and then continued, as many of you know, in a private back-channel discussion, which is an interesting thing in terms of our current discussions. Back channels are not all bad. It depends what they're used for, of course. But Kennedy and Khrushchev developed a back channel which I think saved the world in the end, because it gave them a way to communicate with each other and to build confidence, which turned out to be crucial for the world. But the day of the Bay of Pigs, there was a cable from Khrushchev to Kennedy saying, you may not be aware of this, but your government is involved in international piracy. And Kennedy responded on April 18th, I have previously stated, and I repeat now, that the United States intends no military intervention in Cuba. While refraining from military intervention, the people of the United States do not conceal their admiration for Cuban patriots who wish to see a democratic system in an independent Cuba. So Kennedy lied blatantly, vulgarly, to Khrushchev. And this was the second time in a short period of time that an American president had lied blatantly and vulgarly to the Soviet leader, because Eisenhower had done it with the downing of the U-2, Gary Powers' flight just months before. It's a bad habit, by the way. Our president should not lie this way, and they should not lie in such blatant, stupid, transparent ways. So this was a deep Kennedy blunder, in my view, that compounded the blunder of the Bay of Pigs. Khrushchev wrote back in a long letter that you could summarize as saying, "Are you kidding? Don't ever write to me like that again." But he said, you write that the United States intends no military intervention in Cuba, but numerous facts known to the whole world and to the government of the United States, of course, better than to anyone else, speak differently. And Khrushchev goes on to tell the truth, that this is a U.S. Operation, and don't you ever claim it isn't. And this is a disgrace, and it's against international law, and you have invaded an allied country of ours. And Khrushchev was right, and he had been right with Gary Powers. And it's interesting in this regard recently with the death of Zbig Brzezinski, whom I admired for many, many things. It recalled an interview that he gave recently before his death about the American support, CIA support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And of course, this is the birth of Al-Qaeda. It's another completely, in my view, disastrous CIA-led operation, and the list is endless of CIA botched foreign policy disasters. But in this case, the Soviets claim that they invaded Afghanistan because the CIA was mucking around to overthrow the Afghan regime. And we laughed and mocked at that and look at the Soviet paranoia and the excuse, and Brzezinski said, but of course it's true. We did this well before the Soviet invasion. We hoped that it would trigger a Soviet invasion. It was a great success. It triggered a Soviet invasion. It gave them their Vietnam. Of course, it gave maybe 1 million deaths. It gave us Al-Qaeda. It did many, many awful things. But this kind of lying is what the security state does for a living. And it is one of our big weaknesses, that we're surrounded by lies all the time. And presidents speak lies relentlessly. It just flows off the tongue. But basically, it is the covert CIA operations that lead to them over and over again. Well, I think the Bay of Pigs triggered many awful things, but this was a very difficult period of the Cold War anyway. From 1958 to 1963 was probably the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, all centered in Germany. That was the main, well, not all centered. Germany and Cuba became, of course, the two places where the Cold War nearly became the end of the World War. And many things were going on. This is a deep question about what was really the essence of this conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, especially at this time, and why was Khrushchev pushing so hard in Berlin. And I personally think the best interpretation of this, of any history that I know, is by Mark Trachtenberg at University of California in his remarkable series of articles and books, culminating in a book called The Constructed Peace. And he explains that basically the Cold War, to a very significant extent, surrounded the failures to solve the German question from the point of view of the Soviet Union. And the German question was how to secure Soviet security in the post-World War II era, because Germany was considered a continuing threat. It was to everybody. The Western argument was we will make that threat go away by giving the squeeze of friendship in the European community and in NATO, and so Germany will become part of a U.S. Western-led alliance. But that wasn't a great answer from the point of view of the Soviet Union, and especially one of Eisenhower's ideas, because Eisenhower was a very shrewd and very capable man, and also a very fiscal conservative, very tight on fiscal policy. He wanted security at the lowest cost. So one of his continuing ideas was that Europe should defend itself with its own nuclear weapons. And Eisenhower thought that a nuclear Germany might be the right answer. The U.S. wouldn't have to have troops in Europe. Germany would be able to defend itself. And from the Soviet point of view, a nuclear Germany was just not attractive. In the immediate aftermath of the Nazi era, when the Soviet Union had lost more people and had more destruction and had more tragedy, and the idea that now, having, quote, won the war, to end up even more vulnerable was a profound point of distress. And so Trachtenberg's view is that a lot of the Cold War was, what are you doing? You're preventing the legitimate security needs of the Soviet people. I find this very plausible, by the way, from everything that I have read. And the U.S. was either not very caring about it or rather flippant about it. Kennedy came to appreciate those concerns in Trachtenberg's view, and I'll come back to that story. But things were hot in the Berlin front from '58 onward, including the building of the Berlin Wall, which started to go up in '61 because of the flood of people out of the GDR. The U.S. basically thought that this was a reasonable way to avoid outright conflict to go along with this. But it also led to another one of these moments where things could have completely gone disastrous when 10 tanks from each side faced off against each other at Checkpoint Charlie. And it was a test of nerves, and Kennedy was cool, and Khrushchev was cool in the end, and this was finally resolved after an extraordinarily tense few days. But we were repeatedly probing the limits of stumbling into thermonuclear war. And then fast forward, of course, Khrushchev decided that in view of the invasion of Cuba, the alliance that was forming with Castro and the Soviet Union, the U.S. nuclear weapons in Turkey, and not very well protected, exposed, dangerous, and close to the Soviet borders, that he would teach Kennedy a lesson to tell him what it's like, and to do that by installing offensive nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. And when Khrushchev explained to Gromyko that he was going to do this, Gromyko said, "Are you crazy? This is insane. What are you doing? You're going to cause nuclear war." And Khrushchev laughed, by the various accounts that I've read, said, "This isn't war. This has nothing to do with war. This is just to stick it in Kennedy's face so they get a taste of their own medicine. It's not about war." And everything I have read and know about Khrushchev tells me that this is right, but that it was a little bit of quid pro quo and don't invade again. And of course, the U.S. was planning on invading again or killing Castro in one way or another. This was very high on the agenda. And so Khrushchev decided to do this, and we all know the story, and so I won't recount it in any detail, except that it is for us, because of the recordings of XCOM and the history of what happened, absolutely one of the most important events of modern history, to remind us every day how dumb we are, how vulnerable we are to ourselves. And don't trust your generals ever about peace. Maybe about war, but not about peace. Because what is true is that if Kennedy had listened to the vast majority of his advisors, and he had LeMay in the room, who was basically on the verge of insubordinate the whole time, rude, abrasive, almost flirting with overt insubordination, we would not be here. Let's put it that way. We came so close during this period to accidental launches, pilots going off course, ships that could have fired under the orders of their captains, advice that weapons that were already primed to fire and were on order to fire if attacked were not yet ready. So many miscalculations. And the basic point that kept us alive, with all of the various details and the back channels and the famous genius of listening only to one of the communications from Khrushchev and ignoring the second one, and Robert Kennedy's back channels to the Soviet leadership. Kennedy saved the world. I think it's really true to say, by being human and profoundly decent, profoundly rational, profoundly careful, and ultimately profoundly moral, in my view. And with the basic idea that he had, which went back to that statement in the inaugural address and to his feeling of this tragic side of human history and endeavor, that don't make a misstep, and it's humans on the other side. And that's a really, really important idea. It's humans on the other side. This is not a very prevalent idea in most diplomacy. In most diplomacy, it's vermin on the other side. It's subhuman people on the other side. It's animals on the other side. It's irrational people on the other side. It's people who don't deserve to live on the other side. It's people who just hate us on the other side. It's people who hate us for what we are on the other side. I think this is almost always wrong. And Kennedy felt that it was humans on the other side. And really, I think, had a kind of feeling that Khrushchev was probably surrounded by the same kind of people that he was surrounded by, and that Khrushchev was his best buddy in this crisis. And that if he and Khrushchev could hold the line against their own hotheads, maybe they would find a way out of this peacefully. And that's what happened. We were extraordinarily lucky. So many things could have gone wrong. But the more you revisit it, and again, I think it's true of all of our modern history, don't listen to the CIA about almost anything in terms of operations. In terms of intelligence, you give the CIA credit. They spotted the missiles. I'm all for intelligence, by the way, trying to figure out what's going on. But it should be intelligent, first of all. But this covert war part is where they fail again and again and again. Well, what I learned from my own amateur history, reading, thinking, researching this period for writing the book, is that the missile crisis profoundly affected Kennedy. I think it is fair to say it touched him to his soul. I think it's fair to say that from the October missile crisis to the end of Kennedy's life in November 1963, Kennedy rose to the level of greatness, that he had a depth of humanity, purpose, vision, statesmanship, and political agility that reaches the greatest achievements of the American presidency. So the first year and 3/4, not so great, stumbling around. But from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the end of his life, in my opinion, true greatness at the highest caliber of leadership. But one thing that Kennedy really felt was we cannot go on like this. We came too close. Despite the fact that he came in determined to avoid the abyss, there he stood at the abyss. And he and Khrushchev had had an experience never shared by any other people on the planet, that the fate of all of humanity was in their hands. And they had almost lost everything. And I think that he was profoundly transformed by this. That's my reading. And that he was determined to find a way back from the brink. And that's what I call his quest for peace. It was a campaign for peace. And a campaign is a strategized, sustained effort. And he made it, and he succeeded, and it was brilliant. Now, one step along the way was this meeting, which in Trachtenberg's mind was a key moment. Trachtenberg's history, I should say, was a key moment of spurring Kennedy, because basically de Gaulle started playing around and saying to Adenauer, who rather longed for nuclear Germany, if the Americans won't do it, I'll do it. We'll do it together. I'll give you the technical backing for a German nuclear, and I will pull you out of the US-led NATO alliance. This will be a Franco-German alliance, and you'll get your nuclear weapons. And this spurred Kennedy even more. We need to resolve the German question, and we need to move to some solution. And again, I'm relying heavily on Trachtenberg's interpretation, which I find to be very cogent, that Kennedy took a firm decision. Enough of this. Germany will not be nuclearized, and we're not going to allow de Gaulle to do this, and we are going to move forward with an understanding with the Soviet Union. And by recognizing the Soviet interest in a non-nuclear Germany, we will be able to make steps to retreat from the brink. So it's not only blunders of Bay of Pigs and then placing offensive weapons in Cuba, but it's also getting to the deeper political questions that will get us back from the brink. And I think this is important too. We often see the Cold War, I mean, in America, we see it as only the Soviet cause, which is nonsense. Or we see it as just blunders, which is also nonsense. The Cold War had real political issues. And the core of it had a lot to do with Soviet security, which is something we never want to consider. And I think this is a big mistake. Just like we didn't so much like nuclear weapons in Cuba, the Soviet Union didn't like them in Greece and Turkey. And by the way, Russia didn't much like the idea of Ukraine becoming part of NATO. And we just regard that as, well, that's their choice, as if it was Castro's just his choice what to do. And this is the failure to think symmetrically and to take the other point of view and to understand. It's what my colleague at Columbia University, Robert Jervis, calls the security dilemma also. You always think, you're right, we're just defensive. We're just defensive, we just draw the line right on the Russian border. And we don't say at all, well, how would this be viewed from the other side? And Kennedy really was brilliant at thinking about the other side. That was his genius, actually. That's what kept us alive in the end. So after this so-called Élysée Treaty, Kennedy sped up and said, we're going to stop the nuclearization of Germany. I'm going to get involved in German politics because Adenauer is not going to get this way. And we're going to speed up the negotiations for a nuclear test ban treaty, which had been going on and off for years and years and had been stymied over many issues, including the inspection issue for underground testing. Another great figure of the time, Pope John XXIII, who was dying of cancer in the spring of 1963, said, I will use my last remaining ounce of life and power to try to help move towards peace. And he wrote a magnificent encyclical called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. And it was Norman Cousins, who was editor of the Saturday Review, was kind of a three-way back channel connector of the Vatican, the White House, and the Kremlin in the spring of 1963, bringing a hand-signed Russian-translated copy of Pacem in Terris to Khrushchev, who was eagerly awaiting it, and the encyclical to Kennedy, who was inspired by it. And Pacem in Terris is a wonderful document. It says that statecraft is not just about power, it's about morality. And states should deal with each other on a moral standard. It's not a standard we believe in. It's not what realism in international affairs teaches. I think Pope John XXIII had the right point. And it is that added bit of humanity on the other side which can help to bring about the peace. Well, Kennedy went on a campaign for this treaty, and he gave a speech on June 10, 1963, which was the greatest speech of an American president in modern history, in my view. And if you haven't listened to it recently, maybe not once a week is needed, but it's absolutely beautiful. It's online. You can watch the whole speech. You can read it. It's so beautiful. It's wonderful. But Kennedy's main idea in this speech was he was talking not to the Soviet Union, do this, do this, do this, and we'll sign a treaty. None of that. He was talking to the American people, saying we need to change our mentality so that we can find the path to peace. Never before or after do I know of another presidential speech like this. And if some historians do, I'd love to know. Let me just read a few parts of it quickly, and I'll try to keep on time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. Wonderful. And he's basically saying we're trapped in a prisoner's dilemma, is how a game theorist would put it now. Can we find a way to the cooperative outcome? Does it really make sense that the arms race is the only way? And then he says, some say it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them to do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. That's remarkable, in my opinion. I just don't know of any other presidents that talk this way. It's the opposite of pandering. It's challenging. It's asking to revisit one's own ideas. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impracticable, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. That was Kennedy's style of leadership. And the practicability in this time was a treaty, a partial nuclear test ban treaty, which he thought would be the stepping stone to nuclear non-proliferation. And then Kennedy goes on to praise the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Magnificent. Magnificent. It would be like the president praising the achievements of Persian culture and the Iranian people today. Unimaginable, yet he did it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. A wonderful term, a Greek classic term that played very heavily in Kennedy's thinking. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity, but we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Wonderful to praise your counterpart, to tell your own citizens we must re-examine our own ideas. Khrushchev immediately calls Averell Harriman, the U.S. envoy, to the Kremlin, and says that is the greatest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with this man. And within 6 weeks, the treaty is signed. The speech is an inspiration. The speech is a bridge. The speech says we're both human. We have a common interest. We can find a way out of this mess. Incredibly, Kennedy gives another magnificent speech the next day. And I just want to frame this because for Kennedy, the interplay of our domestic decency and our international capacity to make peace and solve problems was inextricable. We don't feel that way anymore. But Kennedy gave his greatest speech on desegregation the very next day after the peace speech. That's a lot of good writing for Ted Sorensen, by the way. And he said famously, we are confronted primarily with a mortal issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. It's the same reciprocal vision of decency, morality, the golden rule, the humanity. And this is Kennedy in a period of true greatness. He went to Berlin. In Berlin, not only did he say, Ich bin ein Berliner, but he convinced the German people, we are with you, we will provide security, and he told them, and you will not have nuclear weapons. And both sides were needed. Germany needed security. And Kennedy convinced them, we will be with you to give you security, but you will not be a nuclear power. And he thereby cleared the way for a mutual peaceful understanding with the Soviet Union. And he basically, with the politicians that he met, made it clear it was time for the old man, Adenauer, to go and for Erhard to become the chancellor. And Adenauer ended the chancellorship just a few months afterward. Kennedy then gave another magnificent speech in the Irish Dial, the Parliament. And to me, the most important line of that great speech is, indeed, across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember that there are no permanent enemies. Hostility today is a fact, but it is not a ruling law. The supreme reality of our time is our indivisibility of children of God and our common vulnerability on this planet. And this is his mission for peace. Kennedy then took the case to the American people. Everything in his mind was, okay, we can sign a treaty, but I will not be Woodrow Wilson in 1919. This could go down to defeat. The hardliners, the right wing, the security establishment could fight. This requires politics. And here is Kennedy as a ward-level political brawler and as the greatest statesman, because that's what great politics is. He had to win a vote. It wasn't just writing a great speech. It wasn't being a statesman, being a diplomat. He had to win the vote in the Senate. And so he went on a magnificent campaign, called in the political chips, went on speaking, gave press conferences, got key thought leaders around the United States engaged, and won Senate ratification overwhelmingly, 80-14. And this was the signing on October 7, 1963. One of the great triumphs of political vision and political courage. Then Kennedy spoke at his last speech, of course, to the United Nations. Another one you should listen to and savor. It's beautiful beyond belief. All the wonderful things we can do using science for cooperation, working together, fighting poverty, fighting hunger. Kennedy is soaring at this moment. Kennedy is reaching a level of leadership absolutely unparalleled for this time. It's dazzling. And I love the conclusion of the speech. He says, 2 years ago, I told this body that the United States had proposed and was willing to sign a limited test ban treaty. Today, that treaty has been signed. It will not put an end to war. It will not remove basic conflicts. It will not secure freedom for all. This is Kennedy-esque. He doesn't oversell, but it can be a lever. And as Archimedes, in explaining the principles of the lever, was said to have declared to his friends, "Give me a place where I can stand, and I shall move the world." My fellow inhabitants of this planet, speaking to all the world leaders in front of him, let us take our stand here in this assembly of nations, and let us see if we, in our time, can move the world to a just and lasting peace. It's amazing that in the midst of this, one more disaster, Kennedy is kind of dragged along. Again, the security state, we got to take out Diem, a bloody coup. Many of you know Kennedy is aghast when he hears the news that Diem was not just overthrown, but was murdered. And he runs out blanched from the Oval Office. He's so profoundly shaken by it and feels tricked again by the security state. Let me go 2 minutes over just to conclude. A couple of lessons, some lessons for peacemaking. Define our goals clearly. We are trapped in what is called the security dilemma, thinking everything we do is fine, everything the others do is an aggression. We now know from neuroscience that this is a kind of confirmation bias or self-bias that is profoundly dangerous. Peace needs to be constructed. It doesn't just happen. It has to be constructed around a common political idea. You need moral imagination. Moral imagination means the belief that you're dealing with human beings on the other side. You need politics. This isn't just highfalutin thought. You need to win votes. And I won't go into it at length. I think all these lessons are completely relevant for us today. And I want to conclude with what I believe are the most beautiful words of any president in modern history from the peace speech. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much.